having really no support in these abusive, sexually abusive situations at work. I'm kind of still enduring all of this. And so I felt truly like my only option out of that was that I had to end my life. And so I get to a point where I attempted suicide. I say by the grace of God, I survived.
What's going on, guys? How are you? Could you use a little hope, healing, peace, maybe even a little adventure? Well, that is the only reason we're here. Guys, you were made to connect with God, which is why we focus on a spiritual approach first, and we let that guide everything and anything else moving forward in our lives. Today, well, if this isn't an invitation to peace, I'm not quite sure what is. We have Morgan Merchlin with us. She's a former firefighter, Miss Ohio 2024, and we talk about her invitation. It came in the midst of some darkness and pain while working as a firefighter, trying to escape the pain with pills, a suicide attempt, an involuntary stay in a psychiatric hospital, and some godly intervention, of course, through it all. Hey, quick reminder, this is not for little ears. Hopefully it will be helpful to you in some way. And if it is, would you just take a second and leave a review, subscribe, even shout it out on social media? You could literally be saving lives and families simply by doing those things and making this more available for them. All right, let's jump right in my conversation with Morgan Merchlin. All right, we are here with Morgan Merchlin. Morgan, how are you?
I'm doing good. Excited to talk today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I appreciate it. And we are going to jump kind of right into this. The main question I always ask of all of my guests: low points, failure, the real stuff of life, getting into that. If I asked you that question, if we were sitting down for a coffee somewhere and I just said, look, hardest part of your life so far, low points, what comes to mind? What would you think?
Yeah, well, right off the bat, I would say that probably the majority of people, if they looked into my career as a firefighter paramedic, they would quite frankly consider it the entire thing a failure. So yes, yeah, very deep there.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I started off my profession I was 18 years old when I started working, but I started training at 16. So I was still very much a kid, really, if I think about it. And right from the get-go, I failed. I failed in the academy. I was small. I was short. I struggled physically than the most other people there. And I truly failed my way through school. And then when I started off at the fire department, things did not go how I anticipated.
Well, hang on there for a second. So you failed the academy and you failed at school, but then you're still at the fire department. So
Right.
Take us back a little bit. How does that look? What does failure in the academy and failure in school kind of look like?
I guess I should say I did succeed in the end, but it was not at first. Yeah, it was not at first. Where some people could physically, they were able to just go in, throw a ladder and, pass that test right at the start. That wasn't really possible for me. I had to learn how to do things differently for my body and what I could do. I think I was at a disadvantage. More than anything was my height. Being shorter made things really challenging. And then, of course, as a woman, I don't naturally have the upper body strength that a lot of men do. And so that meant I had to learn how to do everything really using my legs, my core, and so really relearning techniques. And so it took me, multiple tries to get to that point of success. And so, I don't think there was really a single thing I can think of in the fire academy that came naturally to me. Everything was a struggle from the start. And so, but I persevered. So, I didn't give up. While it took me multiple tries, I was able to at the end, pass everything I needed to. And so I started off 18 years old working for the fire department. And, when you think of being a first responder, one of the first things, especially having parents that were first responders, that came to mind to me was the brotherhood, this idea of joining a family. And especially in the fire department, you live together. It's 24 hours on, 48 off. So you're spending quite literally a third of your life with these people. And so I kind of went into it thinking that it was just going to be like one big happy family, and it was going to be great. And that was truly.
Hey, is that kind of what you heard from your parents when you say they were both? What do your parents do?
Yeah, so my parents are both in law enforcement. That's actually how they met. So both my mom and dad were police officers, and especially my mom, I would say, I grew up really at the police department with her. And so I saw the interactions. She had a lot of coworkers that were like big brothers to her. And while it wasn't always perfect, you don't get along with everyone. And I knew that. I saw that they had each other's backs the majority of the time. And so that's what I kind of anticipated for myself, was joining this brotherhood, and inheriting almost like, a whole family of big brothers.
But yet you went to the fire department instead, though.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did.
You didn't have any interest in police, huh?
Oh, I did.
Oh, gotcha.
So I started off thinking I wanted to be a police officer. I wanted to be just like my mom. And I was like, I can't wait till I'm 21, though. I was like, I want to get started right away. So that's what led me to the fire academy, was just genuinely the fact that I could do it younger at 18. But I fell in love with it from the start. I especially love the EMS part. I've always kind of had an interest in the medical field. So that was great. And then I did enjoy the challenge that I felt like firefighting gave me. The fact that it wasn't easy for me. I enjoyed that everything was almost a challenge for me and I had to work through it. So I fell in love with the job as soon as I started the training.
Yeah, so talk to me real quick. I mean, a lot of us guys probably don't understand. So kind of coming in from your perspective, girl, firefighter, lots of guys around dealing with the struggles of having to, was there an issue with them, kind of holding you at a certain level, thinking she's not strong enough to do that, she's not big enough to do that, why is she here, whatever, kind of let me in on that, how that looked from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say there's kind of two different groups that I experienced when it came to firemen. So there was one group who did not want me there because they felt like I ruined it for them. They joined that job also for the brotherhood, and for them, the brotherhood didn't include any women. So me being there was kind of, something that they didn't want. They felt like they had to, quote unquote, behave if I was there. And that was a big part of the fun for them. A lot of them their wives didn't like it. They had an issue with the fact that I was, spending 24 hours. So that kind of caused tension for them. And then there was another group that was, looking for a girlfriend. And so they thought that, they could, being a young female, I definitely experienced a lot of manipulation, a lot of men that felt like they could seize on that. And so that was kind of mainly the two groups that I experienced. Of course, there are some good ones out there. Few and far between, I would say. But there are some good ones out there that a lot of times they were girl dads, and they had a daughter. So that helped a lot. But yeah, that was kind of what I experienced right off the bat.
Okay. So you got through the fire academy. You're rolling into your first job. Now take me kind of through what that looks like starting as an actual firefighter, EMS paramedic.
It was definitely a lot. I think one of the things I always say was being 18 years old, not only was I having to learn how to just be an adult, which is a whole nother thing, I was learning how to be, a professional, how to have a profession specifically as a first responder, which comes with a lot. And so right off the bat, I had really no coping skills. So when I would, deal with difficult things, deal with stress that comes with just life, I really hadn't developed that yet. I was still very immature in that capacity, that I didn't have that skill set to kind of handle the pressures and stresses that came with the job. And so it was a struggle from day one. And then culturally speaking, I just didn't fit in. I think the fire service has made strides in the fact that they do accept women, but with the caveat that it has to be the kind of woman that they think should be there. So I've always been more feminine. Obviously, I like makeup. I like being a girl. I've always said God made me a woman because I'm a woman. So that was a big thing.
We should probably also mention Miss Ohio 2024, right? Yeah.
Yes, of course. I did Miss Ohio. That didn't come till later in the career, but that's always been who I am, and I didn't feel like I should have to change or hide who I was to be accepted, and that really frustrated people. They did not like the fact that I wore makeup or that I had my hair done, whatever it was. they have accepted the kind of woman that truly acts like a man, acts like one of them. And that was never me. So that is kind of where a lot of the tension, I think, started out as.
And could you take us back a little bit? You mentioned all the stress and struggles with a job and also growing up. What are a few of those that really stick out to you that you had to deal with, besides kind of the girl and the man profession? But what are some other stress and struggles that came in?
Well, of course, I mean, you see difficult things. You see people at their worst and having their worst day. And so that's hard. And then I would also say that I think as first responders, we have a lot of very toxic traits that we like to kind of pass on to one another. So, culturally, I was exposed to obviously a lot of drinking to handle those things, on just unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so that played into it. And then also working those 24, 48 shifts can be challenging. And the fact that if you do work for a busy department, you're not getting any sleep. And I've always said that I think sleep is such a big part of being a healthy individual. And so when you're sleeping, 4 hours, 3 hours a night, that's going to add up. That's going to wear down on your body. And then additionally, too, I was going through paramedic school. So I would work a 24-hour shift at the fire department, have to go straight to paramedic school for, 8 hours or so. And then the next day off that I would have, I'd be having to do clinicals and clinical rotations. And then it'd just be right back into the firehouse. So it felt like I was in this never ending loop of just stress, anxiety, pressure that I couldn't get out of.
Were there any calls specifically that stick out in your mind, one or two, or a situation that you thought of, this really weighed on me a lot, or this sticks in my head, or even maybe to this day, I still can't not stop thinking about it in a bad way, but it just is always going to be there because it's the biggest call probably I handled or something like that?
Yeah. I don't know early on if there was, there was a couple things, not any that really stick out, but definitely especially later on in my career, I struggled when it came to any sort of suicides that I saw or suicide attempts. In particular, to this day, I had, a young man who was 19 years old who slit his wrist, and he truly slit his wrist. And it was actually the first time I'd ever seen arterial spray blood. So just that being graphic, and then
absolutely.
seeing him, someone who was truly in pain, who did not want to live anymore. So those ones were always a struggle. And then of course, obviously the successful suicides were horrible, seeing the impact it had on their family, and just, hearing those screams are always, I think, something difficult to have to digest.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, so then walk me through. Now we're kind of going down the path of dealing with all this and kind of getting through your career a little bit. What does that lead into that comes to mind when I ask about the failures and the low points?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that happened. I always say, I obviously started struggling with my mental health severely. Was severely depressed, had lots of anxiety. I stopped eating. I lost weight rapidly. I was just extremely unhealthy. And that kind of opened the door. Unfortunately, when I talk about having worked with people, there is definitely some predators out there. And so there was actually a couple people that kind of saw that I was struggling. And instead of, having cultivated a culture where we should help each other, these two people saw that I was struggling and kind of seized on that. And so I had really just these toxic relationships that were now in my life. One was kind of meant to be like a mentor relationship. That's how it started off as. And, looking back now, I can see that it was definitely, I think, like a grooming situation. So I think that was one of them. And then the other two was just as unhealthy, someone who kind of reached out to me, presenting themselves as someone who wanted to help me, who could see I was struggling, and ultimately just wanted, sexual favors from me. And kind of tried to use that
in the firehouse.
In the firehouse, yeah. So I was definitely preyed upon at that time, and that kind of opened the door for a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of things that were happening where I felt like I didn't know. I was already at such a low point. I was scared. I had no idea who I could turn to. Who are you supposed to turn to when your coworkers are the ones who are doing this, or your supervisor is the one who's doing this? I mean, you feel trapped. You feel like you don't know what to do in that situation. And so that all was going on during this time. And so, I always say I grew up with faith. I always believed in God, but during this time, because of truly the terrible things that were happening to me, I definitely questioned how could I have a God that loves me and is allowing this to happen to me? So I definitely fell out of my faith during that point in time.
So you mentioned faith. If you could go back a little bit and just kind of explain to me kind of what that looked like for you growing up, faith wise, religion, church. Kind of when I say those words, what was the viewpoint of that from you?
So I had a mom who was very strong in her faith, like grandparents who were strong in their faith, and so we grew up going to church, maybe not super regularly, but it was a part of our lives. And I always presented as I believed in God. I believed in God growing up, but I didn't have a relationship with God. And I think it's actually two different things. And so and a lot of times too, I feel like my faith was kind of more of my family's. Like I didn't really cultivate or take the time to foster that faith within myself, but I kind of leaned and relied on my family's strong faith. And so when those difficult times came, I didn't have anything to turn to because I didn't actually have that faith that was strong beforehand. So I think, I always go back to that. I think that believing in God and having a relationship to God is two different things. So I didn't have a relationship with him. And so I didn't have that resource or support when I needed it.
So at the same time, you didn't have a relationship, you didn't think, but you are questioning God as to why this stuff is happening in my life. So you do believe There's a God there, there's something there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So take me to that point where your faith, I don't want to say becomes real, but where you realize that it's time to either dig into this more, or how do we get to the point that your faith becomes more real and you kind of go from there?
Right. So, as I'm going through all of this, I became to a point where I was extremely unhealthy. I was suicidal, and I had been suicidal for quite a few months before I actually attempted. I had written a letter. I had kind of been trying to get everything in line, and I had kind of had parts where I had attempted before, but not very seriously. Like I had stood on the ledge of a parking garage. I had, tried to cut my wrists. I tried all these other things. And then I just got to a point where I was like, I just can't do this anymore. And I always say too, I don't think I wanted to die in the moment. I think I truly wanted to escape the pain that I was in.
And is this still why you're in the firehouse at this point,
Yes.
Still working as a firefighter, EMT?
Yep, still working. Gotcha. And having really no support in these abusive, sexually abusive situations at work. I'm kind of still enduring all of this. And so I felt truly like my only option out of that was that I had to end my life. And so I get to a point where I attempted suicide. I say by the grace of God, I survived. And so it was actually in the hospital after I attempted suicide that I kind of had this moment where obviously when you're in a psychiatric hospital, you don't have your family around. So they were gone, and I ended up actually in a horrible facility.
Can I bring you back just a little bit when you say you attempted suicide? Kind of walk us through a little bit what that looked like, what that situation was, kind of where you were at or what you were coming from. Were you at work? What's that look like a little bit more? Yeah,
so I was in medical school, so I was supposed to show up to a ride time, so at a fire department where I was on the medic, and I didn't. I had made the decision that night before that it was going to happen that next day. But I remember, so I had been kind of over the last few weeks then stealing my mother's prescription. So she had a neck injury. And so she was prescribed narcotics for that. And so I was kind of slowly stealing one pill here and there. That way it wasn't as noticeable. And so just kind of stockpiling that. So I decided the night before that this was how it was going to be, and I was going to do it the next day. But I still remember I got up and I got dressed as if I was going to the right time. And I still was trying to decide what to do. And so I took all the pills.
Was there something that happened to get you to that specific day, like this is just the time, or was it just a culmination of everything, or what led to that specific day?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it was kind of everything combined, but specifically I'd kind of just broken down at work. I'd broken down and I had told somebody about one of the situations that had happened with the sexual abuse. And so I told this person, And then I panicked because I was like, I haven't, nobody's has known this, what happened. So I just panicked and I kind of took everything back. And the next day, or it was actually probably like a week later, obviously firemen talked. So a lot of it had gotten out. A lot of that story had gotten out. And it obviously came out that, I had made this up for attention. And so I was at the hospital and I was by the EMS room. We had just dropped off a patient and there was like another fire department. And I didn't even know these people. And I heard them talking about what had happened with me and how I made this whole thing up. And that just felt like, it was like the last straw to break for me. I'd had all these things happening. And then now I felt like my reputation was ruined. It was slandered and I didn't know what else to do. And so I think that's what kind of led to it. And so that morning I got up, I got dressed as if I was going to the clinical ride time, and I put all the pills in my pocket. And I drove to the firehouse I was supposed to be at. I remember sitting in my car and being like, maybe I should just go in and ask for help. And kind of having this moment where I sat there and was like, am I really going to do this? And then I backed out of the parking lot and just, I drove to a Walmart because I wanted to get clothes I found in my uniform. I bought clothes to change into. I was embarrassed. I didn't want somebody to find me wearing a uniform. So I threw my uniform in the trash, went out to the parking lot, and then that's where I took the pills. And obviously then at that point in time, it had been a couple hours that I had been missing. And I turned the location off on my phone because I obviously didn't want people to track me. And so I have a mom who's been a detective before.
Right.
And so when she kind of got the call, like, hey, we're a little concerned, they haven't shown up. And then she saw that, I turned my location off. That's when she started to panic, and kind of went out looking for me. And so eventually, I was found, I was taken to the hospital.
So she just found you in the parking lot, or how,
After a while, so I didn't realize that my car had a tracking thing on it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, cop parents. And so they were able to find the location of my car.
Gotcha.
And that's how they found me. And so then I was taken to the hospital, and I spent several days just kind of getting medically cleared at the hospital. And it was then that they had determined that that's when my pink slip was going to start. So they were going to do 2 different medical stays. So I had to be medically cleared before I could, be put on a psychiatric hold. So then I was put on an actual pink slip, so 72-hour hold. And
so they were going to. Before you go on, just for the people that might not be first responders listening, as far as pink slips go, you want to throw that out and explain that real quick for them?
So a pink slip is something that we call when we put either someone who is a threat to themselves or a threat to others. They're put on a 72-hour hold, so they at a minimum. So they have to stay in the hospital for at least 72 hours until they're deemed safe before they can leave.
So they pink slipped you when you went in?
Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I was then told, we're going to have to transfer her to a psychiatric hospital. So my mom, and I had opted, we were like, can I go to an Ohio health facility? And they're like, yeah, that's fine. So they load me up in the ambulance and I'm, supposedly on my way to this Ohio health facility. And I get there, I get just dropped off the ambulance. So EMS takes me, they just drop me off in this room. I have no idea where I'm at. No idea. And there's just a paper sitting in front of me. And someone walks in and she's like, I'm the head counselor here. We just need you to sign a couple things and then we'll get you back. And I didn't have any phone. They take your phone, they take your possessions, your belongings. So I didn't have anything. I couldn't call my parents. I had no idea where I was at. And so I just signed this paper. And what that was basically deeming that I, in addition to my pink slip, was going to voluntarily admit myself, meaning that the staff could keep me there as long as they wanted until they deemed me safe to release. And I didn't know at that time.
As long as they wanted, as in literally as long as they wanted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I get dropped off into this facility and immediately I know I'm not where I'm supposed to be. What had happened is they had taken me to a place called Ohio Hospital for Psychiatry. So it's not an Ohio health facility at all. It's basically a for-profit psychiatric hospital that has been shut down. If you look it up, has been shut down multiple times for sustained reports of sexual abuse, physical abuse. It's a horrible place. So I get dropped off. I have no idea where I'm at, and I'm literally in this room, and I'm with people who are in like active psychosis, so active hallucinations, male and female. There's no separation. It's just this big room of people, and I immediately am crying. And I remember going up to like the desk where I saw a lady in scrubs and being like, "Can someone just please tell me what's happening?" And she just turned her back to me. And so eventually, I found out that they had dropped me off at this psychiatric hospital. And because I was over the age of 18, my parents, they showed up at the Ohio Health Facility they thought I was going to, and I wasn't there. And there was no way for them to figure out, where their daughter was. So they were also panicking kind of on the outside. And so truly through this entire thing, though, there was little acts, I think, of God and his grace. So one of the nurses at the first hospital I was at kind of saw how panicked my parents were and was able to go into my chart and tell them that I ended up at this hospital. And so they immediately were going to try and work on getting me out, because they also knew that this place was horrible.
And again, you had signed whatever, so
yeah,
you can't go. Can you not go back on that after you sign it then, I assume, or how does that work?
No. So after they dropped me off in this room, there's no one. There was kind of a plexiglass wall where the nurses' counter was. But they treated us like animals, so they wouldn't even respond to anything. It was just a big room that I was just kind of dumped in. And it was truly something like out of a nightmare. I just remember it being freezing. Obviously, I didn't have any clothes. No one's talking to me. I have no idea where I'm at. But there was thankfully a phone. And so I was able to figure out how to call my parents. And then once I was able to call my mom and speak to her on the phone, we kind of connected the dots at what had just happened. And I remember her being like, I'm going to fight for you. Like, we're going to fight to get you out of here. So during that time, obviously I kind of said before, I had nothing. I didn't have my family with me. I didn't even have my own clothes. All I had was just the hospital gown that was on my back. And so truly in a time of crisis and having nothing else, I turned to God. And I just remember like praying and crying out to God to help me and to save me from this situation. And, just saying, please God, if you save me from this, like you give me a second chance at life, I will dedicate it to you. I will live for you. So it was truly, and in that moment, I just felt this peace wash over me. Just this immense feeling of like God was with me. Like, even though I didn't have my family, I had God, and he wasn't going to leave me. And so that's kind of when, my faith was revived. And so I remember walking up to the glass. And this was also, an act of God. And my mom had gotten there. They wouldn't even let them in the hospital, but they could stand in the hospital parking lot. And my mom had my Bible that I'd had since I was a kid. And she set it down in the parking lot to one of the workers and was like, "Please just give my daughter this Bible. I know we can't see her. I know you're not going to let her come out, but please just give her this Bible." And so this one worker in particular kind of, I think, just took pity on my mom, seeing how distraught she was. And so she came back and gave me my Bible. And so I had that Bible with me the entire time I was there. So it didn't, I held it while I slept at night. I didn't let go of the Bible, and I just read the word. And
so real quick, if we can walk back just a little bit, you're at the point in the room, everything is going against you. You really don't. You said you kind of not walked away from your faith, but you really were questioning God and what he was taking you through and, whatever throughout your career. What do you think it was as you're in that room, kind of desperation? What do you think it was that made you call out to God to come help or whatever, however you did that?
I guess desperation is maybe a good word. I would say when you are at absolute rock bottom, when you have lost everything and you don't have anything, truly God was the only thing that I had in that moment. I didn't have my dignity. I didn't have the outside world. I was locked away in this hospital. I didn't have my parents. I didn't have my family there with me. I had nothing. And so truly my only option in that moment to cling to life was God. And so it was probably, a moment of, I have nothing else. I have nothing to turn to. So I might as well try to turn to God and see if he responds. And he did. He did. So, I think that's probably what it was.
Gotcha. And so he responds, he through him or through whatever that worker was nice enough, kind enough to finally at least give you the Bible that your mom had come in and given. Start taking us through there then. How does it work that clearly you're out, you're chilling, you're relaxed now out here in the world. So how do we get back?
So I knew that my parents were fighting for me, which really sustained me, knowing that, I had God fighting for me as well, but also my parents. And this place is so horrible and so known to be horrible. I mean, my parents called judges and they worked, on the weekends tirelessly to try and write, a court order to get me out. Truly because they knew that, and they know about this place. They know how terrible and abusive and horrific it is. And so people were working for me. My mom just kind of sent out like an SOS. And I had hundreds of people that were praying for me, strangers that I didn't even know, like friends of friends who just knew that there was some sort of crisis and were praying for me.
Did you say praying for you? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, praying for me. That's right. So I think that was a big part of it. And then, when I would start to feel myself panic, be like, am I ever going to get out of here? I would just open my Bible and I'd start reading it. And so one of these times, I'm opening my Bible and reading it, and this woman approaches me, and I had known her because she was in the facility with me, but she was pregnant. And I remember her initially when I first got there because, she, like me, had kind of just ended up stuck in this place, and they just neglect people there. So she was pregnant, but they weren't giving her any prenatals. And so her teeth were just cracked because she had no calcium in her. And so, and then I remember her too, because I think like the second day that I was there, one of the workers came out and was like, hey, we want to talk to you. And they basically told her that her fiance had just been killed in a car accident. And I just remember her screaming about this and begging, please let me get out of here, because she's like, I have a 2-year-old daughter. And, please let me bury her father with her. And them turning their backs on her and walking away and just leaving her screaming in that hallway. And so seeing her, and she just shut down, because I've never seen someone it was like every ounce of hope had just been drained out of her, because, not only was she pregnant and had been in this building, I think she had been there for like 3 weeks, but she, just lost her fiance, and, they weren't even going to let her out of there. And then they used the fact that she was, rightfully so, hysterical over her fiance dying, that, she wasn't safe to be able to be let go and released. So she walks up to me and she goes, I see that you've been reading your Bible. Do you think you could read it to me? And so it was this moment where I just remember crying and being like, okay, God, like, I know it's not your will for me to be locked in here, but, I'm going to use whatever time you give me in here to try to bring as many people as I can to know you. And so I started reading the Bible to her. And then it was kind of just like another person came. And you think about it, I was I'm in a psychiatric hospital. So I'm in with people who are, have also tried to take their lives. I remember seeing someone that, had tried to shoot themselves in the head, who, had all of that, scarring, and their eye was gone. And, and they're in the psychiatric hospital, so hopeless, truly the most hopeless people I've ever seen in my life, and trying to just give them, the word of God to try to comfort them like I was. And so that's what I started doing. And that also sustained me. And I was truly just probably one of the most miraculous, I think, acts of God I've ever seen in my life, was seeing these people come to Christ while we were in this psychiatric hospital. Truly, I've never felt like I wasn't even human. It was inhumane how I felt. So I remember, they'd line us up and they'd walk us down to go get food, and looking at the food they gave us. And it was one piece of bread, and like a slice of an orange, and looking at them and being like, what? And you think these people, there's some people who've been in here for weeks, for months. And he was like, budget cuts, sorry. And so I lost, I think, like 10 pounds in that time that I was there. I lost a lot of weight. And truly, one of the worst things too was, I didn't have clothes. We're all just wearing these hospital gowns. And obviously I'm a woman, so I started my period while I was there. And walking up to one of the workers being like, "Can you please give me something?" And they just would pretend like you weren't there. And so that was a moment too, sitting there in this gown. I had blood going down my legs, and I just felt like I wasn't even a human at that point. I felt like I was some sort of animal there. And so it's truly was the devil, I think Satan in that place. And so come to find out later, that place, why they want to keep people there as long as possible is that they charged me $5,000 a day to be there for care. Yeah. So for supposed therapy and psychiatric care, they charged my insurance $5,000 a day. And so people like me who had actually had insurance, good insurance, they did everything they could to keep us there as long as possible so they could get as much of a profit out of us. So truly just one of the most evil things I've ever seen in my life. And I do think that community of people who are mentally ill or struggling with their mental health are preyed upon by culture, unfortunately, and are treated so poorly. And it's terrible.
Okay, so I don't know if this is too strong a word maybe, but literally to me it sounds like you're in hell in this place, dealing with all that you're dealing with. Take us through. People are praying for you. Your parents are working for you. Judges are trying to get orders taken care of. How do we get out?
So there was this lady who was a nurse practitioner. She was like the head person there. And I remember asking, like, "Can I please speak with you?" And she just immediately was like, "No, I don't care what you have to say." And so every day I tried, though. And I was like, please just give me 5 minutes of your time so I can tell you that I don't belong in here. Like, please just give me a minute, like anything. And that's how I know it was God, because this woman was evil, stone cold, truly was there to profit off of people's misery. And I went back and I remember, like, when I was starting to really, maybe on like day 4, was really trying, kind of losing it. I felt like I would write parts of like hymns that I knew, parts of worship songs that were just in my mind. And so I went back after she told me no, she wouldn't speak to me. And I started writing out just words, parts of hymns that I knew, parts of worship songs. I ended up, and I have this notebook that I said to this day, but I wrote like, "I will not lose hope. I will not lose faith in God." And I just wrote that over and over and over again, probably over 100 times. And all of a sudden this woman comes back and she looks at me and she goes, "Okay, fine. You get 5 minutes." And so I walk in there and I say, "Please, like, I have a family." At that point, my family was willing to pay, and which a very expensive, and facilitate a transfer. If they weren't going to let me leave, they're like, "Please let us take her to another psychiatric hospital. If you want a pink slipper again, that's fine. Just let us take her somewhere else." So they tried that, had tried everything. And this woman finally, I think, was just broken down by my persistence and my family's persistence. Because something I didn't know was that my dad had went there and they wouldn't let my parents in past the door. They said no families allowed. So my dad quite literally stood in the parking lot. And I guess he told my mom that he was like, I'm going to save as much as my phone battery. So I'm not going to talk anymore. He had a water bottle. And he was like, I will stand here. And he stand and looked at their security camera. And he said, "I'm not leaving until my daughter comes out." So he literally stood there for hours and hours. And so that was happening, on the outside. And then I was here begging to be let go. And I think this woman was like, "You know what? She's not even worth the money at this point." So she just looks at me and she goes, "You know what? Fine. I don't care. We'll let you go." So I'm like, "Okay." And then she goes, "How soon can your family get here?" And I'm like, "They can get here now." And so she looks at me and she goes, "Okay, well, I'll let you leave anytime after midnight," which didn't make sense to me at first. But then I realized that if I left after midnight, they could charge me another $5,000 for another day.
Geez. Yeah.
And so it was truly just an act of God, I think. All of a sudden, this woman just broke down and was like, "Fine, we'll let you leave." And I walked out and never looked back.
Did your parents, like looking back on it after you had been through that and you had obviously talked to your parents about it, did they ever say how much they felt like God was working in that situation?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, they were praying. My family was praying. Just everyone they knew. They told everyone they knew to pray. So I really did have hundreds of people praying for me. So I definitely believe in the power of prayer. I remember my mom at one point was just so distraught, and she was talking with my cousin. And I think it was my cousin's idea. It was like, you know what, they're not letting us in this building. And she brought up the story of Jericho in the Bible and how they marched around Jericho. So they literally just drove around this building and just prayed and prayed while they drove around. And so they truly were kind of like where I was at. They were so distraught that they felt like they had nothing else to turn to other than God.
Gotcha. And so then take us through, you get out, your family has you. Where do we go from there? What is the next days, weeks, months?
Yeah. So I mean, the next few days, I just remember being like on cloud 9 almost, like just the little things, like being outside again. It just was, I'm so thankful to God for having saved me. It was, very intense, obviously seeing my family again. I didn't think I would ever see them again. So seeing them again, I remember I had so much anxiety though. For weeks, I had this fear that they were going to come find me, like that these people were going to come find me and drag me back to this facility. So I had a lot of, every night I had nightmares about the place. And so that was a lot of it. But for probably those first few weeks was kind of on like cloud 9 with things. But that slowly dwindled. And I think that's something important too, to talk about, like with mental health. I did survive my suicide attempt. I found God through it, but that didn't mean that all of those deep-rooted issues that I had been struggling with for months went away like that. I still went back to the same life that I was struggling with. So kind of slowly, I still started to struggle with, the depression, the anxiety, and the stress that work brought me.
So you went, after getting out, after kind of having that decompression time, you went back to the fire service? You went back to the same job, or what did that look like?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I was in medic school. And if you have to drop out of medic school or take time off, you can't just start back where you're at. You have to start over. So really, I was only given, I think, like a couple days before I was back. I had to be back. Yeah. So I had to go back to school, had to go back to work. No one really at work knew anything had happened. So I was kind of just going back into that same situation. And I think I paid for that later on. I went through obviously something that was extremely traumatic. And because I felt, on cloud 9 almost, because I'm just so happy to be alive, I didn't really address any of the trauma. And so that slowly but surely started to creep back in. Not only the trauma of like what caused me to attempt suicide, but also now the added everything that happened throughout that suicide attempt and the hospitalization.
Okay. And then so 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're back in the fire service. We're out of the hospital. What does that progression kind of look like to where you're at now?
Yeah. So I still had my faith. I feel like, and faith isn't, when you give your life to Jesus, it's not like you do have this moment where, you feel the peace in the presence and the power of God, but your faith is a journey. And so that's a journey. It's not like just because I turned my life to God, everything was, sunshine and rainbows all of a sudden. That was still something you have to work at. It's still something you have to try and lean into God with, and it's a journey from the get-go. And so I still was, I still had struggles, and it was kind of a constant, up and down battle, I would say, of, these things are happening. My faith was in God, but where does God play into that? And how do I learn to trust God in that process and give him all of those struggles? And so I ended up leaving the fire department that I was at. So I ended up making the decision I was going to stand up for myself. I was going to report the things that had been happening. And, that didn't go well. I reported it and immediately faced a lot of backlash, a lot of retaliation. I was kind of slandered. My reputation was slandered because of standing up for what was going on. And so that was really hard. And, having to trust God with that and that pain. I ended up starting at a fire department that was like an hour away, so not in Central Ohio, but down in the Dayton area, and thinking, okay, this is it. This is my shot at the career I've always wanted. And then again, there was tension. They didn't really want me there. I stood up for what I felt like I believed in. There was a couple of times where I felt like God was calling on me to stand up against some behavior that I didn't feel morally right with. In particular, there was a run where they were making fun of this woman who was having a psychiatric crisis. And, having gone through what I went through and knowing how terrible it is and how poorly you're treated, when you're having those kind of crisis moments, I felt like I had to stand up for that. And that, of course, didn't go well. So I faced a lot of backlash, a lot of resistance. I started the Miss Ohio thing and competed in that, and that only kind of made the tension even worse. You know, I was doing it because I wanted to share my story. That was something I felt like God was leading me to do. Miss Ohio was a platform for me to share the story of how, at one point in my life, I felt like I needed to end it, but then I still was fighting. And also I wanted to spread awareness about, the struggles that I faced as a firefighter, as a female in the fire service. And so I started doing that. And of course my coworkers found out. And I'll never forget one of my coworkers, looking at me and, after he kind of confronted me about this, and he looked at me and he was like, not only are you going to be an embarrassment to yourself and your family, but you're an embarrassment to this profession for doing something like this.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that really caused even more tension. It was not well accepted in the profession. There, of course, were some people that were supportive, but it felt like for every one that was supportive, there was probably about 20 that had something negative to say. And I have always felt like, God called me to stand up when I felt like something was wrong. I felt like I had to stand for what was right, even if that meant I stood alone. And so I brought forth, my concerns. I stood up, I vocalized when I didn't think things were right. And that unfortunately caused just a lot of backlash and tension. And so, I was kind of weighing this year in January, I was kind of trying to figure out, like, should I just leave the fire service? And it was hard because I always felt like God had called me to the fire service. And so there's a lot of times where I was like, God, you've called me to this profession, but yet it's just been failure after failure. And that's why I said, I think most people would look at my time in my career as a firefighter and deem it a failure. I went to 3 different departments, and each one I culturally just didn't fit in. And, I kind of was like, God, why? Why did you call me to this? And so I sat down. I remember kind of having a conversation with the chiefs at my department and just letting it all out there and telling them all of my concerns. And I made the decision, like, okay, like, I'm just going to try to stick this out. I'm going to try to fight through this. And God has a funny way of making sure that his plan happens. And so that week that I ended up getting severely injured, I severely injured my ankle. So I was on a run, like actually running, and didn't see a pothole and stepped in this pothole and just destroyed my left ankle. And so I had to have a complete ankle reconstruction. And so I think that was evidence enough, like, that it was time for me to move on to other things, at least for the time being. I haven't completely closed the door on that profession, but for the time being, it wasn't a possibility for me. And so I had to go through, leaving the job that was always my dream job and kind of feeling like I had to start over with my life. So, and that's where I am now. I'm working in healthcare now. I work in a different field. And I feel like God's given me this season. Obviously I've had to have surgeries on my ankle, but to actually physically, mentally, and emotionally recover from years of the trauma and devastation that, being a firefighter kind of brought to me. And actually for the first time facing, the emotional and spiritual kind of demons that I had while going through all of that. And so that's kind of where I am now.
So tell me this, and this is just me thinking out loud, but as I hear your story and as we talk about godly intervention and the whys and how do I trust God through all of this, and we kind of go back and I think about how you started and the kind of suicide attempt in the hospital. Your faith wasn't, you admitted before starting all that, really your own faith. You really didn't have a relationship. You really didn't have a faith. It was your family's. Coming through all that, being where you're at now, it seems like you have a legitimate relationship with God. You have someone who you trust, talk to, lean on. Do you think you would have found that had you not had the struggles as a firefighter that you had?
Right. Absolutely not. And that's why that time period is priceless to me. Because, after that suicide attempt and kind of turning back to God, I went back to the same toxic and abusive situations I was in. And I was devastated. I remember that last year at that last apartment when I was in that firehouse, I cried every night. I cried every night because, if you think about it, I had all this trauma that happened in the firehouse. So every time I'd lay down in that bunk room, I had these flashbacks. I had all these difficult emotions that came back up. And I just remember I would go down to the kitchen while they were all, upstairs asleep and just cry out to God. And truly, I think God used that to show me that he can still give peace to you even when you're devastated. I would sit there and pray and ask God why. And what I learned, I think, is that sometimes we won't know the why until we're on the other side of heaven. And, a lot of important lessons that grew my faith were kind of fostered during that time period. And so it was definitely priceless for me.
Gotcha. So you mentioned, I'm not exactly sure going back where in the story, but I think it was when you were in the hospital, there was a statement that you made at some point to, I think, God, where you said, look, if you get me out of this, if you fix this, I will use my platform, my abilities, my life to then glorify you. Yeah. What does that look like now that you're out and about and kind of moving forward?
Yeah. So a lot of that, was the Miss Ohio thing. And that's why, even though I faced a lot of backlash and a lot of people who didn't understand, even Christians who just didn't understand why I would do that, I truly felt like that was something to honor God. And so I stayed committed to that. I do a lot of stuff now. It's given me a lot of opportunities like this and other things to talk about my testimony and just share that story of redemption. And I do feel like, God didn't just save me to save me. He saved me to save others as well. And so sharing that story, I think, is important because, someone out there can maybe connect to that or connect to certain aspects of that. And maybe that can help them in their faith walk. And so that means just standing up for what I believe in as well. A lot of the times in the firehouse where people didn't understand, they're like, why don't you just be quiet about it? Why do you feel so bothered to stand up or to, stay strong in your faith or try to share your faith? It's just making things harder for you here culturally. That was part of that agreement with God, that he gave me a second chance at life and I was going to be faithful to him in it. And so while it did ultimately kind of cause the end of my career to come for the time being, I stayed faithful in that. And it was something I truly felt like God was calling me to do. And so, it's been in the little decisions and the big decisions in my life where, I am committed to living for God and following whatever path that is for me. So even though that meant leaving the fire service for the time being, and that was hard and, was really difficult for me to have to walk out, I still walked out of it because I felt like it was something that he needed me to do. So it's following God and the daily choices in life.
So clearly in your talk, there's a lot of wisdom behind kind of where he's led you through and what he's led you to. I'm curious, kind of aside from your story, you weren't in the firehouse too long. What was it? 2 years then ish?
5
initially?
Years.
Well, and just initially before, was it 5 years?
Suicide. So 5 years total. Yeah, 5 years total. So it was probably 2 years before I attempted suicide and then 3 years after.
3 years after. Okay. So looking back on that and having obviously 2 parents in the police department that are strong believers, I'm curious, just as I've been doing this for 23 years almost now. Was there a lot of talk at all about spirituality, God, any kind of religious basis at all while you were in the firehouse that you can think of? Any kind of influence there at all?
Yeah, so that's always been challenging. I think that in general, the fire department is resistant to God, resistant to religion. And that was one of the things that made it difficult for me as a person of faith. That means I live my life differently than probably the majority of people than others. And so that caused, a lot of backlash. But there are some people that I found that also were kind of spiritually led as well. But in general, I think it's something that could save the first responder professions. I really do. You look at firemen and police officers, and we have some of the highest divorce rates. We have some of the highest suicide rates. Generally, they're people who struggle. And I think that truly the answer to that is Jesus. And so I think that I have slowly but surely, even in the short time span, in my career, have seen the little acts of people stepping out in faith and trying to share that and spread that, throughout the profession has made a difference. And so I think it's incredibly important. I can't really say that during my career I saw a lot of that in the firehouses I'm in, but I know others who have, who do Bible studies with people they work for. And then, of course, Heroic Deeds. So that's an organization where I shared my testimony, but they're truly a first responder organization meant to help and foster people's faith. And so things like that are starting to spring up. And I think that's truly our answer as a profession.
Do you think there's a reason specifically, kind of, especially from a female perspective, looking in on the brokenness of the guys in the police profession, fire service? Do you think there's a reason at all that people don't want to talk about that kind of thing, or that it doesn't ever really come up amongst us? We're kind of uncomfortable. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah. Well, I think that they're worried to become an outcast. They're worried to be judged. It's such an odd culture where you have to do things exactly the way that everybody else has done. Everyone has to joke the same, talk the same, act the same. And if you're any different, then you are immediately ostracized from the group. You're immediately shoved to the side. And that's hard. And so I know I faced so much pressure. A lot of my tension in my career came from the fact that I refused to change myself to fit in with their culture, because I didn't believe in that. And things would have been a lot easier for me in my career if I just would have said, I'll stop wearing makeup. I'll joke the way you do. I'll cuss the way you do. I'll go out. I'll drink the way you do, so I can fit in. That would have made things easier for me in my profession. But ultimately, what's the exchange there? My soul, my faith. And that's what it is. So people are kind of faced with this pressure of, I have to choose my faith and my soul, or I have to choose my profession. And it shouldn't be that way. It really shouldn't.
Well, certainly props to you for not getting to that level and being able to stand up for yourself. I'm sure that was
Thank you.
Clearly not easy, but clearly the right thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is there, kind of having gone over all of that, is there any kind of last message? I know I didn't ask a lot of questions and we just kind of went through that, but is there anything, if somebody's kind of playing with this podcast and picking episodes and they land on this one and they listen to you talk, is there any kind of message you would want to share with them if they're in a bad spot, if they're struggling like you were, if they're any kind of situation that they can relate to you?
Yeah. The first thing being, I think, stand for what's right, even if that means you stand alone. And God gave me the grace in every situation. If you do what's right, God will give you the courage, He'll give you the wisdom, and He'll give you the grace to get through it. And so I know it can be hard if you're wanting to choose your faith. You're not wanting to kind of cave into the pressures. I know it can be hard, but if you do, choose to stand with God, He will sustain you through that. Through everything that I went through kind of after I gave my life to Christ, that was challenging in the fire service, standing up against the sexual harassment, debating if this was the career for me. God gave me the grace to get through each of those situations. And so it may not be easy. It may not be the easiest choice, but, God places those things on your heart for a reason. And so if you stand for what He wants you to do, or you follow His will, He will sustain you through it. And so I think that would probably be my advice is if you turn to God, God's not going to let you down. He has yet to let me down once since I've given my life to Him, even though I've experienced the backlash and the struggles and the difficult situations. He hasn't let me down once through it all.
What about for that person who may have absolutely no idea what faith is, no idea what God is, but is in a spot where desperation has ensued and there is nothing else they can think? Is there a right way to do that? Is there a right place to do that in time? How would they reach out to God, you think? Is there any kind of advice you'd have there?
I would say God is near, even if maybe you haven't been a believer your entire life. God is still near to you. He created you for a purpose, and He wants you to turn to Him. So, don't be afraid of that. And also, when I was struggling, with depression and suicidal ideation and all these things, I felt like I was drowning. It truly felt like I couldn't even breathe. And part of why that was so heavy, all of what I was carrying, the shame, the abuse, the harassment, everything, why it was so heavy is it was never meant to be mine to carry to begin with. God wants to take that from you. God wants to take your shame. God wants to take, whatever it is, your divorce, your infidelity, whatever it is you're struggling with, your alcohol problem, drug problem, whatever it is, God wants to take that from you. And it's weighing you down, and it's so heavy, and it feels like you can't breathe because of it, because it was never meant to be yours to carry. So truly turn to God, reach out to Him, just speak to Him, say, hey, God, I need you. and he will, and believe that he will come through for you, because he will.
Cool. Well, those are wise words, Morgan, and I appreciate you coming on for all of us. We all appreciate your time. Yeah. Is there a place or anything you would like to shout out for people if they want to get a hold of you or see what you're up to at all?
Yes. So I obviously have the social medias. So I have, the 2 different pages, the Miss Ohio page and then on my personal page. So I always check the DMs, anything like that. So my Instagram is morg_merchland, MURCHLAND. So, reach out to me. I'm always open to conversation. I can always point you in the right direction. And then also, if you're a first responder, I always recommend Heroic Deeds. So they are truly a charity that is meant to help you. So reach out to me, reach out to them. They have a social media, it's Chad and Toby DePew that run that organization. Reach out to them. They want to be there for you. And they also have a devotional that's actually meant for first responders. So if you're looking for a place to start, then maybe start there. That's kind of how I started in my faith walk, was kind of doing devotionals, and that kind of helped me when I was trying to read the Word. So I think that's a great place to start as well.
You mentioned Heroic Deeds. Is that like a website, like heroicdeeds.com, or
yes,
where you would go to? Okay.
Yep, heroicdeeds.com. So they have 2 sides. They obviously have the store. They have, cool t-shirts, coffee, that kind of thing. And then their charity, which they also have an annual conference. They usually host it in the Dayton area. So it happens in the spring. I don't know the dates of this year, but it happens in the spring every year around April or May. And it's just a conference for first responders who are believers to connect. You'll hear testimonies, you'll hear speakers. It's just a great time. So I definitely recommend that as well.
And that is definitely a faith-based, wide open, like this is clearly a faith-based conference. We don't hide it. We don't skirt around it. That is what it's based on.
Yep, exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, Morgan, well, we appreciate your time again. Thank you so much for coming. We wish you well in everything moving forward. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a great time.
All right, guys, that was Morgan Merchland. And thanks again to her for taking the time to be open, authentic, and hanging out with us just for a bit. Hopefully it was helpful to you in some way. And if it was, again, please, please, please subscribe. Please leave a review. Please shout it out on social media. Please make it available for others. You could literally be saving lives and their family and generations to come as they find this, relate to it, and hopefully they can find some hope, healing, and peace by listening to stories of others. Hey, if you've experienced an invite to peace or have a topic or conversation you think would be helpful that maybe I haven't thought of, hit me up. Chad.Campese, CAMPESE @gmail.com. Let me know. I would love to talk to you and maybe even bring you on. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn and Facebook. Hey, here's a clip from the next episode with Stephen Gould. We talked to him about the search for lasting peace and purpose, witnessing his wife's miraculous change, and how that invited him into a place he never wants to leave. And don't forget, guys, taking a spiritually focused approach first to life, to well-being, it will help you achieve life-altering results. And I don't know where you're at or what you're going through, but if you need an invitation, reach out to me, maybe a guest, but mainly to God. He will meet you wherever you're at. All right, I'm your host, Chad Campese, and I will catch you on the other side.
And I sat there and I got emotional. I was like, I said, I believe in Christ as my Savior. And and this is so corny, brother, but I felt like all this weight come off my shoulders. I felt as good as I had felt in years, like a Christmas morning type of feeling.